Good evening. My name is Lisa Champelli, and the story that I have to share tonight is a Native American folktale from the Pacific Northwest, a region of the country that is home to a variety of owls, which appear frequently in Native American stories. Some tribes see the owl as a protector, and some tribes believe that the owl can see into the future. And some tribes, as in this story, see the owl as a symbol of death or as a messenger from the spirit world. Long ago, there lived a young girl. She lived with her family in a sheltered bay by the ocean. And this girl was famous for her beauty. Many young men had sought her hand in marriage. But her father, who was chief of the tribe, had refused all offers. He was happy with his family as it was. He had no need to create alliances, and rich as he was, he had no need for the gifts that most of the suitors pledged. But in time, his continued refusals created an ill will. The girl grew impatient to wed and start a family of her own, and the neighboring tribes grumbled about his stubbornness. And one young man who had been frustrated repeatedly angrily denounced the chief and openly declared his hope that ghosts would come and carry off his daughter to the land of the dead. Now the chief, he paid no attention to these bitter declarations. But at dusk the next day, an owl heralded the arrival of 12 canoes. These canoes were filled with people singing very festive, joyful songs. They pulled their canoes up onto the beach, and a handsome young man, finely dressed, stepped out and went to the chief and immediately asked for his daughter's hand in marriage. Now, perhaps it was because this young man was accompanied by a great number of relatives, or perhaps it was the exceptionally fine gifts that he presented. But the chief consented, and the young man and the young girl wed immediately. And the wedding celebration lasted long, long into the night. It was the wee hours of the morning when the wedding party climbed back into their canoes and set off in the darkness across the ocean. The young girl set aside her uneasiness at departing so quickly with these people that she had just met. She did not know where they were headed, but surely it could not be far, and she would see her mother and father and sisters again before long. It was not yet daylight when they arrived at a shore unknown to the girl. Her new relatives pulled the canoes out onto the beach and then scattered in various directions. In the pre-dawn haze, she could see groups of people playing on the beach. They were all laughing and singing, and some were dancing. Everywhere she looked, everyone seemed to be so happy. She followed her husband across the sand, and he led her to a huge house. It was finely furnished, and many people lived here. She could see rows and rows of children sleeping side by side on raised platforms along the walls. And he led her to a bedroom that was sectioned off by wide mats. And he pulled her down onto the thick blankets, and he said to her, "It's time for us to sleep now." And after such an exciting night and a long journey, she was grateful for a chance to rest. When the young wife awoke the next day, it was late afternoon. It was broad daylight, and sun was streaming through the house. But all was silent. There was not a sound, and everything was so still. And she thought that this was very odd, considering the night before she had seen so many groups of people out and about playing and laughing and playing games, and certainly all the children that she had seen when she came in that previous night. Certainly all those sleeping children would be up and about by now. And she turned to look at her husband, who had fallen asleep with his head on her arm, and she saw that she was gazing into a grinning skull. The young man, the handsome young man that she had married just the night before, was now a skeleton. She dared not disturb the bones and just propped herself up to peer about on the elbow of her other arm. And when she looked around, the house that had been so fine the night before now seemed to be about to crumble. And the rich, lush blankets that she had fallen asleep on were threadbare and filthy. Was she dreaming? How could this be? Only her own clothes seemed to remain as they had been the night before. Everything else seemed changed. She feared to look again at what had been her husband, and she dared not disturb the bones, but she could not remain as she was. And so she slowly inched her arm out from beneath the skeleton and watched as the skull slipped from her arm and rolled onto the blankets. And then she stood up as quickly as she could and made her way across the rotting floorboards. And she found that the children that had been sleeping side by side the night before were now rows and rows of whitened bones. When she reached the doorway, another gruesome sight beheld her. For up and down the beach, as far as she could see in either direction, were bones upon bones, skeletons covered the sand, and some of them still held the positions that they had been in the night before when they were playing their games. The scene sent chills up and down her spine, and for a moment she was just frozen there in shock. But then the sight of the water gave her hope. The canoes. She remembered the canoes. She could take one of the canoes and paddle back across the ocean to her own home. And so she very carefully, because the sand was covered with these skeletons, she very carefully pushed aside the bones so that she could create a path on the sand to walk to the beach where the canoes were floating in the water. They had been pulled up onto the shore, but drifted in the water, and she slowly made her way there, and then found that these canoes, along with everything else, were decayed and rotting. She tried pushing one after the other into the water, hoping that one would be able to carry her, but they just filled with water and then sank. These canoes were not going to carry her away. She was trapped here, alone, among the dead. And she collapsed onto the sand and began to sob in despair. When she had exhausted her tears, she looked up and saw a wisp of smoke curling into the sky. And this was a sign, a hopeful sign that there was perhaps one other human being, perhaps one other person still alive in this desolate, barren place. And she was going to find that person as fast as she could. And so she did not care now about the bones on the beach. She did not worry about stepping on them, but she ran as fast as she could across the sand, stepping on the skeletons and crushing some as she ran as fast as she could to find the source of the smoke. And she found, sitting at a campfire, a tiny old woman. Her back was to the young girl, curled, and she did not turn around when the girl approached, but she turned her head almost all the way around, and then she signaled to the girl, "Come, child, come and sit by me. You are the one that they brought down last night. Come, and I will tell you where you are." The old woman was Screech Owl, a creature who belongs both to the spirit world and to the earthly world, and who can travel back and forth between the two worlds and knows everything that happens in either place. She assured the girl that she would come to no harm. She explained to her, "You have arrived in the land of the ghost people. Those who die on earth come here, and it is at night on earth when the ghosts are most active. But at sunrise, they go to sleep and they lie about as bones, and these are the skeletons that you see. You must only do as they do, sleep when they sleep, and wake when they wake, and all will be well. You'll see. At sunset, the bones will begin to rise. Come sit with me and wait." And so the girl stayed with Screech Owl, and they watched as the sun sank into the horizon and the shadows deepened along the shore, and the bones began to stir, and the voices began to swell, but they were not swelling into choruses of song as she had heard the night before. They were swelling into choruses of angry shouting, for the ghosts realized the girl was gone, and they knew that Screech Owl was the only one who would be able to keep her company in the daylight. And they came running down the beach toward them, shrieking furiously, their arms waving about, for the girl had injured so many of them when she had pushed their bones aside, and where she had crushed the skeletons, she had even killed some ghosts. And of course, her worst crime was that she had nearly killed her husband by half twisting off his head. They arrived at Screech Owl and the girl, calling for vengeance. But Screech Owl calmed them and even scolded them for not explaining to the girl where she was and what she needed to do to live among them. She silenced them, and they agreed to return the girl to her husband, who forgave her for her nearly fatal wounding. And from that time on, the girl did as Screech Owl advised. She slept when they slept and woke when they woke, and she was able to live contentedly for some time in the land of the ghosts. And after a bit, a baby boy was born to the girl, and she was so proud and so happy. But this baby troubled the ghosts, this child that was neither truly ghost nor fully human, and they decided that the girl must return to her earthly home, where in due time the baby would be able to obtain its human form. Now the girl was reluctant to live apart from her husband, but she desired most to remain with her child. And she longed for her mother and father and sisters to meet her son as well. And so at night, she climbed into the canoes with the ghosts, and they traveled back across the ocean to her home. Screech Owl announced their arrival, and the girl's mother and father came out to the beach and built a fire to light their way and welcome her home. Everyone was delighted to see the girl again, and they all clamored to hold the baby, because that is what you do when you see a new baby. You hold that baby, cradle it, and look upon its sweet face. Not yet, the ghosts warned, and they reminded the girl that the baby must remain wrapped, must remain covered for 12 days, and it should never be unwrapped in daylight. For if the baby was exposed to daylight before its transformation to human form had been complete, it would then have to be returned to the land of the ghosts. And with that warning, they vanished. And for 11 days, the girl cared for her child. She watched over her baby. Every day she went into the woods to look for moss to pad its cradle board. And on the 12th day, her mother worried that the girl was gone too long, and she went to check on the baby. She was so curious to see how this baby looked. Did this child look as her own children did as infants? And she decided that she needed to see. She needed to see its face. And so she picked up the baby in its cradle board. And when she unwrapped the blanket from its face, she found herself gazing and cradling just a bundle of bones. And shaking with fright, she cast the bones and the blanket and the cradle board and everything out of the house, and instantly the girl felt ill. She knew immediately that something was wrong with her child. She came running back to the house, and she found on the ground the blanket and the cradle board, and scattered in the sunlight all the little bones of her child. She turned to her mother. How could you? One more day, just one more day, and my child and I could have lived happily on earth. But because you could not contain your curiosity, now my son and I will be lost to you forevermore. And at night, when it was dark again, the ghosts came back for the girl and her child, and they were never seen on earth again. And since that time, no living creature is able to pass back and forth between the spirit world and earth. No living creature, that is, except for Screech Owl. She does not reveal her human form to us, but on occasion, at night, we can hear her call out to us and see her shadow in the night sky. That is the story of the girl who married a ghost, which appears in a collection of tales by the same title.